The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.
Joining me now is Representative Chris Rabb. He's a father, an educator, an author, social justice activist, and he's also the representative for the 200th District in Philly, Northwest Philly. Representative Rabb, how are you? Thank you so much for joining me.
I'm well. Thanks for having me on the show.
The pleasure is mine. I learned about you through the interview that you did with our colleague, Nomiki Const, and as you talked about reparations and the work and the activism that you do there as a representative in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. Just introduce yourself to the audience so that they can become familiar with who you are and what you're fighting for.
Sure, thank you. So I represent roughly 65,000 souls in Northwest Philly. I'm part of the largest full-time state legislature in the country. There are 203 state legislators, 203 rather in the House, 50 in the Senate, and it's currently and for some time controlled by the Tea Party in both chambers. I was elected to office in 2016, the same day as what's his name. So I joined the smallest House Democratic caucus in 60 years. So I was deeply demoralized the night I won because I knew what I was walking into and it was brutal. But despite that fact, over my first 2 terms in office, I was able to pass 4 laws, 4 bills into law that I'm very proud of, which I still can't figure out how I was able to do, but I know I didn't do it alone.
To that point, you are extremely busy. I was looking at some of the committees that you're a part of: agriculture, rural affairs. I mean, I don't have them by memory, so I literally had to put a list together: finance secretary, commerce, judiciary, policy committee, legislative black caucus, county delegation. Like you are out here all over the place doing this work. But just tell us to dig in a little bit about you. What drove you to this versus any other field where you could have taking your expertise?
Well, I mean, I guess the short answer is I'm a troublemaker. And there's a lot of good trouble that can be created in state legislatures and in elective office up and down. And I was moved by the moment. I kind of remember the whispers of my ancestors. I come from a long line of troublemakers, abolitionists, civil rights activists, educators, jurists, artists, and I'm continuing, I'm inspired by the legacy within and beyond my family, and Black folk for generations have led movements, and it called me to action in a way that I did not foresee it. I did not hope to be in elective office. It was not a plan. It was not even an interest. One of the reasons is because I've worked in politics. I've worked in the U.S. Senate for the first Black woman senator in my early 20s. And I said, this place is a swamp. Does that sound familiar? I mean, I said, this is an awful place. I don't know how people can be in elective office. And but I did see the benefit of government and good legislation and powerful advocates. So I wasn't anti-government or anti-public service. I just did not anticipate being the one in elective office. I thought I could be behind the scenes. I'm very active in my community as a committee person, letting people know who's on the ticket, that sort of thing. But now it seems that this is exactly where I'm supposed to be because, when you're in the belly of the beast, it takes a certain type of person to be able to handle that without strangling somebody. And I haven't strangled anyone yet. So that's, it must be something right. But I've certainly wanted to. But, not everyone can operate in the belly of the beast. I think if I were in a blue state with a overwhelming Democratic majority, I think it'd be really challenging for me because, the D behind my name doesn't really mean much to me. It doesn't signify as much as my progressive values. And being a Black person who has benefited from those progressive actions that have actually helped an entire nation is something that I'm more committed to than a political party. And so for that reason, being in the belly of the beast matters because when you're deep in the bowels of a monster, you got to thrash around and be loud and be creative to get out of it. But if you're a complacent soul, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, then, you're going to dissolve in that belly. And that's not going to happen to me.
Wow. Wow. I see on your mantle back there, you have, it looks like, if I can see it, it says Invisible Capital. That is your 2011 book. Subtitle is How Unseen Forces Shape Entrepreneurial Opportunity. And I want to start here in this deeper conversation because in the very first chapter, it's almost like prophetic, right? You speak about Donald Trump, and I want to read this a little portion. You said, take Donald Trump, perhaps one of the best known businessmen in modern times. In Trump 101, his book, The Donald, as he is popularly known, tells readers that they can succeed if they tough it out, listen to your gut, and take chances. What he doesn't tell them is that they will have a better chance to succeed in the real estate business if real estate is the family business. One of the reasons I want to bring that up is obviously Donald Trump since then became the president of the United States. And partly why he became president of the United States is because of the fallacy of the bootstraps that we have in this country, telling everybody if they just work a little bit harder, they can get to the top. And now people admire people at the top, even though they didn't have to work as hard to get there. Would you expound on that in context of your book?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's funny, the expression, pick yourself up by your own bootstraps. So Horatio Algiers, who popularized these novels about the little street urchins who make it to multimillionaire status, he was a second generation Harvard graduate. So he had Ferragamos, right? And when you look at, so if Donald Trump says that, okay, he did it. I mean, he had, $6 million support with those bootstraps. So he was not a self-made man, he was a self-made brand. And so the one thing that he did really well is to create a brand. It's based entirely on fiction, but he's really good at spinning fiction to make a compelling racist populist storyline that, has gotten millions and millions of white folk and some beleaguered and self-hating Negroes to join on his bandwagon, right? But
yes, sir.
It is that notion of individualism and rugged individualism, the shiny side of capitalism that lets Americans believe that, okay, I'm working class, my parents were poor, their parents were poor, but I'm going to be rich, and then I don't want to be taxed like the rich people are because I don't want the government to take my money, even though most rich people have gotten rich as facilitated by taxpayer money, right? The start of some of the largest corporations came through government grants, right? These are the things we say are welfare or handouts to the poor who are undeserving. And yet, whether it's FedEx or Microsoft or the internet itself was funded by taxpayer money, sometimes through military, sometimes through civil pathways. And then they like to bemoan government intervention, and they would not be here without it. And let's also note that when we talk about government, we have to talk about civil servant jobs and how black folk are, in addition to unions, the middle class, the historic middle class was expanded through being able to get jobs in government, federal and down, starting in the 60s when Nixon was afraid that the most radical among us was going to burn down the country. So they said, we need to give them a piece of the pie so that they don't feel that we are the enemy. And it created all these jobs, which also led to affirmative action for everyone else who ain't black. So white women the most have benefited from the things that started with black protest in the streets. And that's some of the things I'm most proud of from my last term in 2019 and 2020 was based on the activism of young people, black folk and other folk, who demanded justice. And that inspired a few black legislators to take down the House, to literally shut it down and demand legislative action on police accountability. We got 2 bills that were enacted into law within 36 days of shutting down the House. And the reason that's important is it was coming through a committee, the Judiciary Committee, that had 840 bills go through it in 4 years, not a single one of which was considered that dealt with police accountability. So these are really the first police accountability bills that have been enacted into law in Pennsylvania history.
That's and some of the other work that you're working on that I got a chance to hear as you spoke to Nomiki in your interview with her. You talked about the work you're doing in reparations. I'd love to explore that a bit with you. But you also spoke about the importance of language. And in that interview, you said to her this, you said, in terms of why you don't use the word slaves, but you use the words enslaved laborers. Well, give me the context for that, because I think that might be a good foray into the rest of the conversation.
Well, yeah, I mean, language is power, right? Words matter, right? Listen, if some white dude rolled up on you and called you boy, I imagine you're going to have a problem with that. Right?
Just slightly, yeah.
Yeah, you might, right? Now, if it was your buddy who you grew up with who was black and said, oh, that's my boy, man, that's my boy. That's a different context, same word, right? But then we have words that go deeper, that dehumanize, like nigger. When you say nigger, and it's a white person, you got a battle on your hands. That is a dehumanizing word. The word itself doesn't mean anything. It's how it's conveyed in what context. We know we're not going to tolerate that, right? You got the hard ER versus the A between black folk, right? We got these nuances. But here's the thing about slave. I'm a family historian and genealogist. I take this very seriously. I descend from 16 great-great-grandparents, all of whom were born into a society before the 13th Amendment was ratified. They all died free. Those people were men and women, many of whom were enslaved by enslavers. It was a condition thrust upon them, as was complicit by state governments and the federal government. They were people. They weren't slaves. They were enslaved. It was an atrocity thrust upon them and their ancestors. We do not want to further dehumanize our ancestors who had the inspiration, who were part of the abolitionist movement, formally or informally. Any enslaved person who wanted to be free was an abolitionist by my standard. Why are we going to dishonor them and call them anything but the amazing human beings that they were, who chose to survive? Because not everyone chose to survive, right? People jumped off those ships in the Middle Passage. They said, I'm not doing it. And I'm not judging those people who made that choice. But we also, all of us, descend from people who chose to survive. And I'm not going to dishonor them by calling them slaves. We need to place the blame at the foot of the enslavers. And that's what they are. They weren't slave masters. They were enslavers.
I think those distinctions are so critical, especially when I feel like in 2020, if nothing else that we're fighting, in addition to COVID-19, we're fighting a pandemic of the absence of truth and the absence or the presence of misinformation and the presence of using language to gaslight, not only from Donald Trump. I mean, I think that's the most obvious, but even down to these arguments in progressive versus centrist conversations about sloganeering, about defund the police, like the language or abolishing the police. It seems to be an all-out war on language and truth. And I know that's kind of broad, because if we dug into this from Donald Trump alone, we probably could have volumes in terms of how the gaslighting of language takes place. But if you could just drill down a little bit in terms of like reparations, defunding the police, white supremacy, and how language impacts that, and even how it impacts your work.
Oh, wow. I mean, language is everything. The difference in any legislator, the difference between may and shall is huge. I mean, they seem just like formalistic terms, but may means you have the option of, shall means you must. So just changing one little word could change the whole trajectory of a bill. I introduced a bill that's been enacted into law that would create a confidential police misconduct database. And right before it left the committee, out of which it was voted unanimously for, some folks snuck in some language that created a loophole that the FOP probably inspired. And now I got to figure out how to close that loophole. And it was just seemingly subtle language that changed it all. Now, when you talk about things that have a big impact, like defund the police, the challenge is, that's a great rallying cry for people who are the most abused, who are the angriest, right? Because there's legitimacy. They get too much money, and too much of the work they do, they have no business doing. They shouldn't be traffic enforcement. They shouldn't be dealing with domestic violence, immigration, mental health. They're not prepared for that. And most cops didn't sign up to do that work. So why give them the money to do the work in a way that other professionals could do much better? So defund makes sense in a very narrowly constructed way and to a various population. But defund doesn't work for me in my role as a legislator. For one reason, it shuts people down, so it makes it harder for me to get things done that people want. And two, you're not talking about what you want. You're just talking about what you don't want. You don't want cops to have more money than they deserve or whatever. But the real issue for me is there's a belief, perhaps an implicit belief, that cops are supposed to keep us safe. Mm-hmm. But I've never felt that way as a black man growing up in Chicago, living in Philly, being the father of 2 black boys who are now teenagers. That's not how I think. I think I want to avoid cops as much as possible, and I have no criminal record. I'm not doing anything wrong, except I happen to be inhabiting a body that is criminalized in this society, as facilitated by both Republicans and Democrats. That is a bipartisan issue. That is white folk who have used their political power to criminalize black bodies in one way or the other. So I'll say this. I'm interested in us having a conversation around community safety, meaning that whoever you are and whatever community you affiliate with, whether you're black, queer, transgender, immigrant, returning citizen, do you feel as safe being a part of that community as a white Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, middle-aged, middle-class, straight white guy? If the answer is no, we have work to do. And the police, that's not really something the police were created to do. The police, as we know it, is an institution, at least in Pennsylvania, for 320 years. Our first police entity, what would become the police, was started in 1700 as the Night Watch. And then over 100 years later, we had a Day Watch where they conscripted poor white people to surveil black folk, enslaved black folk, and free, quote unquote, free black folk in Pennsylvania. And then 1855, they created the first police department in Philadelphia. And at no point between 1700 and today has there ever been any mandate for transparency, accountability, or inclusion in a predominantly white police force. It's never happened. So all the people who are pushing back on defund the police or community policing or whatever reforms people are talking about, my question to them is, well, tell me, when was the golden era of policing when black people felt safe? And the answer, honestly, is, never, because it wasn't created for us. It was created to surveil us. And that means that we have to have a conversation about how do we look beyond policing and not seeing policing in the carceral state as a way to address seemingly intractable issues. So it's not about defunding the police from my perspective. It's about where are the resources to promote community safety. And if that involves some portion of how we define police today, so be it. But if it requires social workers and whomever, then we need to have that conversation. So we have to change our pivot point about what is it that we actually envision for our community. And the thing about it is, too many white folk individuate the problem. They say, well, I'm okay with it or I'm against it. But how do you feel as an aggrieved member of a community that has been historically marginalized? And what does success look like? And that's why language matters. So I'm not hating on defund. I think it has more value from a mobilizing perspective on a grassroots level. I'm okay with that. But, in the halls of power, that framework has no value. So I'm not saying don't do it. I'm not using that term, but I'm not hating on the folks who embrace it because I know where they're coming from and they have valid points.
I find that, and I wish I could go into that particular topic with you more, but I know we're pressed up against the time. So I got to have you back to talk more about the defund the police because I'm fascinated by that framing. But I want to pivot to 2 last things before you go. One is the reparations bill that you are pushing there in Pennsylvania. But then also I want to couch it in context of your progressiveness and where it came from, like the root. And I think if we start with your progressiveness first, and then will lead seamlessly into the work that you're doing in terms of reparations. So how, black man, are you so progressive in these streets?
Well, I'm a lifelong learner. And the more I learn, the more I can't help but be more progressive, right? I mean, sometimes it goes the other way around, I've heard, but that has not been my experience. And, when you humble yourself to accept the fact that there's so much you don't know, that gives you the license to hear what other people are saying. It's like, oh, I never thought of it that way. And that's how you grow. That's how you mature. And that's how you get smarter. I'd like to think I'm not just getting older, I'm getting wiser. And that requires you to listen to people outside your bubble, outside your comfort zone. And so with reparations, I'm reminded of something that my great-great-great-grandfather, Reverend Amos Noah Freeman, did 165 years ago. He left his daughters at home in Brooklyn, and he helped another black girl escape from slavery, who came down from Washington, D.C., through Philly, stayed at William Still's home, who was in the movie Harriet, taken by a white abolitionist from Philly through Camden to Brooklyn, and then from Brooklyn to Manhattan to Rochester to Canada. He safely transferred this little girl disguised as a boy named Anne Maria Weems to her aunt and uncle who'd escaped 4 years prior. So he left his own little girls to help the parents of another little girl who he'd never met before, to help them find freedom, right, in a country that was not their own. And he did that 165 Thanksgivings ago, and that inspires me. He left his comfort zone. He did something for the greater good of his people. He wasn't just speechifying. He put his life on the line and worked with strangers who had the same values. That is progressive. He didn't call himself a progressive. He was a radical Presbyterian minister who was an orphan, and he led with his values. And so I have many stories of like that in my family and beyond, and that's what inspires me. That's what progressivism is. You have to walk the talk.
Yeah, and I think that is so critical, right? So there's a long legacy lineage of progressive action, not just the word progressivism, but progressive action that is even in your own bloodline.
Talk is cheap. Look, I mean, it's real easy to get on Twitter and blow people out, but then when you and you know about that, but when you get in a room with somebody, they get real quiet. I'm like, where's your Twitter courage, right? It's when do you it requires the most courage when you have something on the line. And I've seen a lot of online progressives who get real quiet when they have to speak truth to power in the room with the people who they would otherwise be hiding behind a laptop to defy. And that's the proof is in the pudding. What are you prepared to do? Are you prepared to be the only person in the House of Representatives who will stand up and speak against injustice when everyone is remaining silent? Are you prepared to do that? That's both courage, but that's also the courage of your convictions around progressive values. And to me, progressive means progress. It's about moving forward. It doesn't mean about moving left or right, because those are artificial terms. But we can objectively say this is moving our society forward for all marginalized communities.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely brilliant. With the few moments that we have left, and we'll probably have you back to discuss reparations by itself in great detail, but I wanted to at least let the audience get to know who you are. Tell us about the reparations package that you have moving through the legislature there in Pennsylvania.
I appreciate the opportunity to speak on it. So I'll be brief. This is what I want people to understand. If this is the only thing they hear from me on this issue, reparations is not something just for black folk, and it's not something that has to be associated with slavery. It also doesn't have to be a check, and it also doesn't have to be a one-time thing. All right. So if you understand those things, you can open your mind to the possibilities of what reparations could look like for those folks who have been victimized by systemic racism that is inclusive of, but not exclusive to, slavery. So my forthcoming bill focuses on systemic racism in the state of Pennsylvania as facilitated by the state government. So that is the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive branches, how they either did things that were overtly pro-white supremacist or anti-black, and things that they were complicit in their silence and inaction on over centuries since 1776. That's one thing. And two is that reparations, like I said, is not just a check, because if you are acknowledging that it is systemic racism, that means we have to have systemic solutions. Right. Cutting a check to an individual black person is not a systemic response. So what are the collective benefits for black folk? And what is the entity that determines where that money goes and how it's funded and where it goes, and who should get more attention than others? If you're a black person who doesn't identify as black, do you get individual benefits? I don't think you should. If you're ashamed of being black, I don't want to cut you a check, right? And here's the other thing: I've been in Pennsylvania because I'm a native Chicagoan. I've been in Pennsylvania 18 years. Okay. But if I have friends, neighbors whose people have been here 180 years and have been black for multiple generations in this Commonwealth that has had explicitly racist bills enacted into law for generations, the harm to them is much greater than the harm to me because I've only been here a short amount of time. So for any individual benefits being accrued, I shouldn't get as much as the person who's been here since their people were enslaved in Pennsylvania. That just is fair, right? So we have to have a conversation of what that would look like. And the last thing I want to say is this. I descend from a number of enslaved ancestors across this country: Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, et cetera, Kentucky, Maryland, and New York, where there was slavery. Those were state laws. Slavery was a state law. It was not a federal law. It was a state law. So if it's a state law, that means state legislatures are on the hook. That doesn't mean that the Congress shouldn't provide reparations on a federal level. It also means that corporations need to provide reparations. Universities, foundations, religious orders, whether it's the Jesuits or the Episcopalian Church or whomever, they got to pay up too. My bill will focus exclusively on the state's complicity in systemic racism against black folk who lived in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania from 1776 to the present.
Wow. Representative Rabb from Pennsylvania's 200th District, thank you so much for joining us. We have to get you back sometime to discuss reparations specifically at length. But again, I wanted the audience to meet you, and I know we're up against the clock. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.patreon.com/The BPD Show and support The Benjamin Dixon Show. If you like this episode, be sure to share, like, and subscribe.